Were the Nazis socialists? Well, in a word, no. For details, let's go ahead and roll the intro. Alright, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions as to why I'm making a video like this, and I'll go ahead and clarify here in a bit, but you guys know the drill. Fan art comes first. First we have an action Surus by Baguette, a detailed chibi Surus by Lanfiquette, and then I have the power pose by Moonflower. Thank you all for your submissions, and let's jump right into the topic. Why am I making this video? Well, first and foremost, I identify myself as a socialist. I would personally rather a proletariat have democratic control of the means of production. I'm not a big fan of the exploitation that comes from CEOs having sole control over the labor they give to their workers, so I have a bit of a personal bent in taking on this stupid argument, for the exact same reasons that when somebody tries to tell me that atheism is responsible for genocides during the USSR, all because Stalin was an atheist, I have an issue with that statement as well. But this one's a bit more silly, because when somebody argues that the Nazis were socialists, they're A, ignoring history, and B, they're being linguistic prescriptivists. What do I mean by that? Well, a linguistic prescriptivist is somebody that argues that words have intrinsic meanings, almost as if words are they themselves axiomatic, a brute fact of life. That's not the case though, as words don't actually have meanings at all, words have usages. So when someone argues to me that Nazi is shorthand for National Socialist German Workers' Party, and as a result they must in fact be A, for the workers, and B, socialist, I would have to counter that history is not in their favor. One of the first things that I would point out is a very popular poem from that age. This poem was written by Martin Niemöller, and I know that I'm mispronouncing that horribly, but please, let's focus on the topic. The poem in its entirety reads, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." So who was Martin, and why did he write this poem? Well, he was actually an anti-communist and supported Hitler's rise to power at first. But when Hitler started insisting on the supremacy of the state, his disillusionment began. You see, he was a Lutheran pastor, and when Hitler decided that the state was to be favored in power over the church, he ended up becoming a leader of a group of German clergymen that were opposed to Hitler. In 1937, he was ultimately arrested. He was later released in 1945 by the Allied powers, where he started up his career as a clergyman once more. To quote him directly about his poem that he wrote, "The people who were put into the camps then were communists. Who cared about them? We knew it. It was printed on the newspapers. Who raised their voice? Maybe the confessing church? We thought, communists, those opponents of religion, those enemies of Christians. Should I be my brother's keeper?" Then they got rid of the sick, the so-called incurables. I remember a conversation I had with a person who claimed to be a Christian. He said, "Perhaps it's right. These incurably sick people just cost the state money, and then they're just a burden to themselves and to others. Isn't it best for all concerned that they be taken out of the middle of society?" Then we started talking, until our voices were again silenced in public. Can we say that we're not guilty or responsible? The persecution of the Jews, the way we treated the occupied countries, or the things in Greece, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, or in Holland, they were written in the newspapers. I believe we, confessing church Christians, have every reason to say, "Me culpa, me culpa." We can talk ourselves out of it with the excuse that it would have cost me my head if I had spoken out. We preferred to keep silent. We are certainly not without guilt or fault, and I ask myself again and again, what would have happened in the year of 1933 or 34? There must have been a possibility. What if 14,000 Protestant pastors and all Protestant communities in Germany had defended the truth until their deaths? If we had said back then that it's not right when 100,000 communists are put into concentration camps in order to let them die, I can imagine that perhaps 30 to 40,000 Protestant Christians would have had their heads cut off. But I can also imagine that if we had rescued 30 to 40,000 people, because that's what it's costing us now. When asked about the origins of his poem again, Martin clarified, "There were no minutes or copy of what I said, and it may be that I formulated it differently. But the idea was that the communists, we let that happen calmly. And the trade unions, we also let that happen. We even let the social democrats happen. All of that wasn't our affair. All of this is to say the Protestant church didn't agree with what was going on, but it wasn't really their problem, and they also didn't like the people it was happening to, so who cares? The point I'm trying to illustrate with this poem and the history behind it is that people within Germany recognized that communists, socialists, and trade unionists were the first people taken by the Third Reich. But where does this misconception come from that the Nazis were socialist? And why am I convinced that the current political climate here is getting slowly close to what we actually had in Germany? Just like how people on the left wing in America aren't really seen in a very positive light, I guess because we argue that things like healthcare are a human right? I don't know, let me know in the comments section why you hate me. The point is, the environment here is actually starting to look a lot like what we saw in Germany around that time. We've actually had concentration camps in this country before. We did it to the Japanese, and we've been doing it to immigrants recently. And if you want to get pedantic about the definition of concentration camp, I'm going to go ahead and say it. You're probably part of the problem. Again, argue with me all you want in the comments section. Past that, we have a self-titled nationalist as the leadership head of our country right now. We've had movements within the country that have stirred up a lot of media buzz, like the Unite the Right and the Straight Pride Parade. Whether I like it or not, a lot of the really anti-socialist rhetoric is starting to crop itself up in my country again. Hell, I've even seen it from my parents. Alright then, that out of the way, let's take a look at some history. In 1919, a locksmith named Anton Drexler founded the German Workers' Party. The political parties then were still a relatively new phenomenon in Germany, unlike what we have here in the States, where political parties are pretty well established. The party, over the course of a year, evolved into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or what we would later know as the Nazi Party. This happened because there were a lot of players vying for influence in the early years of the Weimar Republic. This party, though, was made up of a lot of fringe actors, and it really didn't gain any recognition outside of its regional area until Adolf Hitler started shaping it into something different. Shortly after the party's creation, Hitler took full control over it. And Hitler, unlike the original founder Anton Drexler, understood the value of language very, very well. He knew how to sway a crowd. He knew how to make them laugh. He knew how to make them cry. I mean, hell, look at any early Nazi propaganda that came from Hitler. He's convincing, and there's nothing wrong with admitting that. Literally, millions of people were convinced by him to do horrible, atrocious things. You don't get that unless somebody's convincing. So how did Hitler do that? Well, he paid lip service to the tenets suggested by the name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, so that he could appeal to the proletariat. You know, the people who actually lay down the foundations for any country to function. The base working class, the people who make up the majority of your country, the people who will be making an effort in democratic elections to determine whether or not you will get power. He tried to appeal to these people, and he used it through a party that, in name, appealed to their values. His primary goal, though, was to use the name of the party and the tenets of the party to achieve power for himself. It didn't help that in November of 23, Hitler was convinced that he needed to utilize the democratic structures in the Weimar Republic to attain his goals. The country wasn't exactly what you would call stable, and that's usually a very easy area for a fascist to take control. People need hope, and Hitler was willing to sell them that hope. Again, he did this by appealing to workers, but how exactly did he do that? Well, you can thank brothers Otto and Gregor Strasser for that. They started creating propaganda for Hitler's nationalistic rhetoric by focusing a lot of their efforts on the suffering lower middle classes. So let's go ahead and think like a socialist thinks. One of the people that most socialists will hold issue with is billionaires, because their exploitative labor practices lead to a lot of the issues we have in society now. Poverty, homelessness, lack of viable healthcare, these are all things that are born from having for-profit industry. But let's say you take the majority of the working class, people who aren't terribly well educated in a variety of fields, people who just know their trades. It's no big secret that one of the easiest things for people to do is find somebody to blame for their problems. So what did Otto and Gregor Strasser do? Well, they took that same energy and focused it on different minority groups. Instead of focusing on people who were actually exploiting these workers, they convinced them through propaganda that Germany's economic freefall came because of communists, socialists, and ultimately Jews. To his credit, Otto Strasser eventually recognized that the Nazi Party wasn't a party of socialists. Not sure how it took him so long to figure that out, but there's a lot of people in the States that can't figure this out either, so I guess I can't blame him. In 1930, he broke away to form his own anti-capitalist movement. His brother, Gregor, remained the head of the left wing of the Nazi Party, but by that point, it was already too late. The propaganda had worked. The workers firmly believed that their enemies were the minority parties, the Jews, the socialists, the communists. So what was Hitler's next step from here? Well, I talked about how nationalism is an issue in my country, and Hitler allied himself with the leaders of the nationalist conservative movements of 1933. From this point, the Third Reich was effectively born. But how did Hitler manage to do this? Well, simple. Remember those wealthy capitalists who are actually exploiting labor of people, and they're the people who I hold issue with personally? Hitler did them a bit of a favor in deflecting all of the public outrage from them to other minority classes. On top of all that, Hitler noted to them in private multiple times that in reality, while his party is called the Socialist Party, he would definitely be making sure that things would be good for wealthy capitalists. And if the only thing between you and your principles is a dollar amount, then you're pretty easy to buy. Turns out, a lot of capitalists are this way. I'm not saying everyone is, but this is certainly how things turned out in the Weimar Republic during this point of its history. The Third Reich at this point was completely mask-off fascism. Within 2 months of it being born in full after his allyship with the conservative parties, the Enabling Act was passed. The Enabling Act is what allows Hitler to have dictatorial powers over the state. The Enabling Act was passed by deputies from the Nazi Party, the National People's Party, and the Center Party, or the Catholics. It was this allyship of the Roman Catholic Church with Hitler's Nazi Party that's led to many atheist criticisms of religion's allyship with the state ever since. By this point, the German civil service that originally had communists, socialists, Democrats, and Jews in it had been completely purged of these classes. So it's kind of weird to me when people try to argue that the Nazis were socialist when historically, socialists were one of the first people they went after. The Nazis allied themselves with the right-wing conservative front of their age and purged their left wing almost entirely. Speaking of left-wing things, trade unions were completely outlawed in the following month after the Enabling Act. After this point, Hitler banned all political parties aside from his own. Everyone who was part of the German Communist Party and the Social Democrat Party, they were arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps. Again, I'm sorry, every single one of you who thinks for some reason the Nazis were socialist. Hitler did not like socialists. History doesn't agree with you. Speaking of the purging of every single left-wing ideological bent the Nazi Party may have once stood for, again, in name only, you know how Otto Strasser left to go do his own thing because he realized what the Nazi Party was when it finally had its mask-off moment? Well, his brother, who, like I said, was the head of the left wing of the Nazi Party, Hitler ordered his murder in June 30th of 1934 during the Night of Long Knives. This was one of the many acts Hitler took to completely purge the left wing out of his party. Again, I'm sorry for any of you that have had this idea that socialists are evil people trying to steal your money. I'm sorry that reality doesn't actually reflect the things that you've been taught or indoctrinated into. But the reality is, Hitler was not a socialist. The Nazis were not socialist. They were socialists in name only. And if you're something in name only, then that name is nothing but a mask. And if the only thing that you can identify something by is its mask, then I'm sorry that the public education system has failed you so thoroughly that you can't see past the first layer of history. Just peel back that layer. Peel back that label and what's actually underneath. It's no different than if I hand you a box of potato chips that is labeled a box of potato chips, but inside you find chocolate chip cookies. You can't argue that I handed you a box of potato chips because that's what the labeling on the package says. The reality is, I handed you a box of cookies. There's only one problem. These cookies were laced with arsenic, no different than the poison that the Nazi Party spread throughout its own country. Germany fell for it. Let's not let America fall for it as well. One last thing. I'm sure I'm going to get at least one comment of somebody saying that the Nazis were all killed and they were taken to task during the Nuremberg trials and that Nazis don't really exist today. Much like with how the Nazi Party began as a socialist party and then evolved into the fascistic regime that we saw and the mask came off, so too has Nazism evolved. It's no longer a political party. It's no longer just the bad guy that we can fight against in our World War II shooters. There are people to this day that fully subscribe to this ideology. And make no mistake, it's an ideology. It couldn't survive as a political party, because as a political party, it has the ability to be dismantled, dissolved, and taken down. An ideology does not have the same weaknesses. An ideology, unlike a political structure, can't truly die, but an ideology on its own doesn't have any power. It has to take its root in the people. It has to convince them that it's a good idea. Then it can manifest into politics again. Political parties are ideologies given form. The trick is to educate people so that the ideology can never be given form again. And hopefully I've done my part here in doing that. If you liked the video, leave a like. Share it with your friends if they honestly thought the Nazi Party was also socialist. Support me on Patreon if you like what I do. And at the end of the day, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and that it was somewhat informative. As always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.